Welcome to this special discussion on democracy and governance in Africa, a look at elections in Nigeria and across the continent. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I am the director of the Wilson Center Africa program. In the Africa program, we work to address the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. To learn more about our work, follow us on Twitter at Africa Up Close. So, on February 25th, millions of Nigerians voted in Africa's largest election. This was one of the most competitive elections since the country's transition to civilian rule in 1999. Despite some improvements during the pre-election period, including the passage of a new electoral act, reports on election day from domestic election observers and international observers showed that the elections fell short of citizen expectations. Nigeria's Election Commission has declared the candidate of the ruling All Progressives Congress Party as the president-elect. However, opposition parties are yet to accept the legitimacy of the elections. So, the many controversies surrounding these elections underscore the task ahead for Nigeria. As Africa's most populous country, and the first of several major elections to be conducted on the continent this year, what tone has these elections set for the rest of the continent? In addition, Nigeria is also Africa's largest economy, and it's also on track to be the third most populous country in the world in 2050. How should the US continue to focus on Nigeria's immediate and long-term importance? To explore these questions, we're joined today by two co-leaders of the Joint International Election Observer Mission that was organized by the International Republican Institute, IRI, and the National Democratic Institute, NDI. Ambassador Mark Green is the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center. His distinguished public service career spans several senior level positions in the US government, including serving as the administrator for USAID and US Ambassador to Tanzania. Ambassador Johnnie Carson is one of America's top diplomats. His distinguished foreign service career includes ambassadorships to Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. He was the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and he currently serves as the Biden administration's special presidential representative for US-Africa Leaders Summit implementation. So my first question, ambassadors, thank you so much for being here. You've both just returned from Nigeria. Please share with us your analysis of the elections. What stood out in terms of the outcomes, expectations, successes, challenges, and really love to know your thoughts on the tasks that lay ahead for Nigeria. Ambassador Green, I'm going to start with you.
Great, thank you. And it's good to be with my friend Johnnie Carson. We've seen a lot of each other over the last couple of weeks. But first off, for me, was the warmth of the Nigerian people. And I'm not just saying that. I found them incredibly welcoming, proud of their democracy, proud of their country, and proud of the possibilities for the future. So that's one of my most vivid memories. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that these elections were a missed opportunity. They were a missed opportunity in the sense that they fell short of consolidating the democratic future that I think all Nigerians want to see and they deserve. There were a number of technical issues, logistical issues that occurred in the administration of the elections. Quite frankly, it was all foreseeable and avoidable, and I think there was a sense of disappointment with Nigerians. Even those who supported APC, I think they were disappointed that there were the snafus, if you will, and problems that fell short. Obviously, the story isn't over. As we know, it's likely that there will be an appeal to the courts. I think speaking for the entire mission, we think it's very important that any disputes that take place go through the legal means, go through the court system. But again, impressed with the Nigerian people and their dedication, I think disappointed with the way that this fell short of what it could have been in the administration of the elections.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Carson?
It's a pleasure to have been out in Nigeria over the past week with Ambassador Green. I think we worked extraordinarily well with the two organizations working in harmony in support of democracy. But let me give you my thoughts, which mirror those of Ambassador Green's. I thought the Nigerians who were at the polling places went there with energy, with enthusiasm, and a desire to cast their votes and to be heard as electorate. They wanted, in many instances, to be a part of the democratic process and to witness the change that was about to occur. I think that INEC underperformed. INEC's performance was extraordinarily disappointing overall. We saw many instances of polling places opening late, polling officers not having the right equipment to carry out their responsibilities, and we saw a real breakdown in the transmission of results back to the polling place. In many instances, our observers found that the DIVA system, the electronic voting system and recording system, failed to live up to its high expectations. I think Nigerians had great expectations that this would be a successful election, that it would improve over the 2019 elections, which were delayed and marred by violence, and that it would improve over the 2015 elections. The one thing that one can say is, unlike 2015 and 2019, these elections were held on time, but the number of administrative and logistical problems that flawed the outcome.
Thank you both for your assessment there. So democracy and governance is an important policy priority issue for the U.S. government. This month, we have the second U.S. Summit for Democracy, and then it was also identified as a key policy outcome, a priority outcome from the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Elections often provide us an opportunity to reset or rethink our relationships with different countries. As we saw in the case of Nigeria, as both of you have pointed out, we saw core illustrations of democratic resilience. And this is not only in Nigeria, but across the continent in several countries that will be having elections this year. We see young people, we see citizens across the board putting their hope in the system. What would you say are opportunities that exist for the US and other international partners and friends of Nigeria to think about as they look to the relationships around democracy and governance issues with the continent?
If you want me to start first, Oge, I would say that we must continue to support civil society. We must continue to support those organizations inside of countries that support democratic values and principles, that want to see free, transparent, and fair elections, that want to see stronger democratic institutions, want to see checks and balances on government officials. We must continue to work with governments directly to talk to them about what is necessary to establish strong judiciaries, strong legislative bodies, and to have presidential and executive authority checked by the courts and by the legislatures. I think it's important that we continue to espouse our fundamental values and principles in favor of democracy and why democracy provides the kinds of opportunities that most citizens want out of their governments and their countries. We must continue to work at all levels to promote democratic principles, democratic values.
Thank you. Ambassador Green?
Agree with what Johnny's just said. Maybe I would take it a little further by saying that in our dealings with African leaders, I think it's important that we prioritize this in the discussions. to be clear, not because we think we've got it perfectly. That's not the point. The point is that we all know democracies are the only form of governance that can address their problems, that can fix themselves, that can reassess and evolve and build that brighter future. And so we think democracy is important because in a very young continent with a very bright future, it is essential that there is a mechanism for citizens to seek redress from their government, to help shape their future. We have expressed disappointment in the administration of the elections in Nigeria. There's no disappointment in the willingness of everyday Nigerians to go to vote. Again, the lines were long, the days were hot, and yet they were absolutely dedicated to it. That spirit is something that is important to us. It's part of what makes America who we are, and we should prioritize it in our discussions.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for those responses. I think across the board, we see with recent polling that came from Afrobarometer polling basically showed that Africans prefer democratic systems of government over other forms of governance. And increasingly, we see that it's not only about democracy itself, but they also want to see accountable governance. At the end of the day, the type of government that emerges after an elections, because we know the real work that happens in terms of building institutions happens during the pre-election and the post-election period. But over time, and data has also shown that since 2019, governance has sort of flatlined across the continent. And it's really worrying and concerning for African leaders and civil society actors alike, because if it continues staying at this low level, it could actually impact some of the goals that the African Union has also set for itself through Agenda 2063. And Ambassador Carson, I know you were just out as well for the AU Summit in February. And this conversation on governance, how do you, with the US government and African leaders, basically focus on partnership in trying to ensure that we prioritize accountable governance? Because citizens are really not just looking for democracy in name, but they also want to see a democracy that delivers for the people.
Let me just say that you've summed it up, and you're absolutely right. In order for democracy to be sustained, it has to deliver. And the issue remains governments must be responsive to the needs of their citizens. And citizens must be able to turn to their government and expect that their views and their issues will be appropriately handled. I think this is a part of the broader conversation that has to take place, and that leaders must recognize that if in fact they do not address the needs of their citizens, respond to their core problems, that this will engender hostility and will undermine the values of democracy that governments want to advance. Governments must deliver to their citizens. And in many instances, we've seen democratic backsliding in Africa over the last 5 or 6 years. We have seen coups d'etats in Mali. We've seen them in Burkina Faso. We've seen them in Guinea-Conakry. And we've seen a number of governments taking steps that undermine the freedom and the values of their citizens. These are things which are going to inevitably lead to the kind of situations that we must encourage governments to address. Governments, as I say, must in fact be responsive to their citizens. Governments also must provide opportunity. They must be seen to be open to progress, openness to greater education, greater employment, greater health care. And these things, I think, come best under democratic governments that are responding to the needs of their citizens. Mm-hmm. It's got to be a part of the conversation constantly.
Thank you. Ambassador Green, your thoughts on democratic participation and government accountability on the continent?
So one of the items that Johnny mentioned, let me pick up a little bit because I think he's dead on. You know, in the U.S., we oftentimes take the path of least resistance in our diplomatic dealings. So we have the head of state that we deal with most often, but investments in the legislative branch, so the separation of powers and oversight. Investments in civil society, which is the connective tissue between citizens and their government, and quite frankly, the strengthening of political parties so they can become mature, issue-based. All of those things will help democracy deliver. Again, life is always easier if you only have one person to deal with, but it doesn't solidify mechanisms in countries that help them take advantage of the innovative power that are in young people. And I think that's really crucial. This should be Africa's time. It's a young continent, bright, energetic. Again, I was really impressed with the young people we met. But the only way that works is if they have an opportunity to be heard, if they have an opportunity to shape. If African leaders listen to the voices of their young people, the sky's the limit. Absolutely, the sky's the limit. But young people have to believe, not that they get everything that they want, but they at least are heard and have that chance to shape the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you. Really, really good points that both of you have made. So we're going to round up the conversation now, and I'd like to give both of you the opportunity to give some final thoughts on the conversation. Ambassador Carson, I'm going to start with you, and then I will close off with Ambassador Green before we round off the discussion.
This is Africa's time. There's no question about the enormous potential of the continent. It is the youngest, fastest growing in terms of population, and increasingly influential on the global stage. As Ambassador Green has said, young people and women are an important part of the future of the continent. And if their ideas and views are not taken into account, then the future of the continent will be at jeopardy. It's also an important time for African leaders to take advantage of the enormous economic potential and opportunity that exists in terms of changing things and changing them in a way that improves their societies and their countries. It really is a great opportunity to look forward, to be more progressive, open in the terms of the things that they're seeking to do. So it's absolutely a critical time. I think looking at Nigeria in particular, this is Africa's most important country. You know, it's Africa's largest democracy, but it's also one of the world's largest democracy. It's a country with enormous potential, and it's important that Nigeria succeeds and we help those democratic and economic forces to succeed. Because if, in fact, Nigeria is unable to move forward democratically, what does that say for the other states, much smaller, less able around it? I think that despite the challenges of this past election, I think the U.S. needs to double down on trying to strengthen its relationship with Nigeria, promoting both democracy, good governance, good elections, but also working to help strengthen the economy and open up opportunities for young Nigerians, both men and women, but also to realize the full potential. We can't afford to turn our back on a country like Nigeria because Nigeria represents not only so much to the 220 million people who live there, but so much to West Africa and Africa as a whole. Its contributions can be more significant and influential and meaningful under a democratic government which is allowing its society to prosper and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ambassador Carson.
I agree with what Ambassador Carson's just said. Maybe what I'll do is pick up where he left off on Nigeria. Oge, as you said, an election is not democracy. An election is a benchmark in democratic development. So the elections in Nigeria, democracy isn't over, elections aren't over. What happens in these next weeks and months is critically important. When the final disputes are all taken care of, the president, it's important that he governs for all of Nigeria, that he reaches out and listens to the voices of those who were in opposition, were his rivals, and governs for all of Nigeria. Nigeria is an incredibly diverse country. It's a very, very complicated country in so many ways, but it's crucial that there is a sense of national identity that is reinforced and refreshed after these elections moving forward. Nigeria has unlimited potential, and I think it really, if it handles these coming weeks and months well, then it really does set an important positive tone for the crucial elections, as you pointed out, will take place on the continent in 2023.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. If I can just summarize a few of the key points that I heard through the discussion. So elections are but just one part of the democratic process. The period leading up to the elections and after the elections are an important time for building and nurturing democratic institutions. African leaders, civil society actors, the US government all agree on a focus of democracy and governance. But there also needs to be consistency in our messaging on democracy and governance. Citizens want to see democracy go beyond just labels and titles. They want to see democracy that delivers for the people. They want to see accountable governance that delivers for citizens. So here at the Wilson Center, we will continue following these issues, and we invite others to continue following these issues with us. And we thank you both for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You said it better than we could.
Nicely summed
Thank
up.
you.
Yeah.